So thank you very much for having me this morning. I thought I would just take a few minutes to share a little bit about what we've been doing at Beamish over what seems actually an inordinately long time as part of our remaking Beamish project. It's for those of you that perhaps don't know, quite a number of years ago, a group of us were taken to the middle of nowhere, locked in a bunkhouse by our then director and told to kind of get creative for a week. I think it's no secret that the museum had seen a downturn in visitor numbers, a kind of downturn in income. We needed to, I think, get a bit of a grip on our future direction. We needed to have a review of the stories we were telling. We needed to look at our relevance, I think, for our communities. And so for 5 days, we were locked in a bunkhouse in the middle of the North Pennines and really kind of, just told to brainstorm. And lots of ideas came out of that. It was really quite a helpful exercise. Some of the ideas were mad, some of them, but out of those mad ideas, you kind of scale it down and you start to look at what you could do, I think. And one of the things that came out of that few days was the fact that we have quite a strong agricultural story in the Northeast. The museum is very lucky in that we have two exhibits, if you like, that were always here, that were associated with farming, but both of them have a very much a kind of high farming story. So one was the home farm that was part of Beamish Hall and the very, very large rich estate of that. And the other was a sort of, I suppose, upper middle class tenant farmer. So in the 1820s. So both of these not normal stories of farming, or perhaps stories of agriculture that a lot of the people in the Northeast would recognise, and in many respects not necessarily relevant to their story or their history or the sort of farming that their family may have done for generations in the upland regions of Northumberland and County Durham. So we decided that what we really needed to do was to show something that people would recognise agriculturally, but also some people would recognise from all over the place. A hill farm, very much a hill farm, and whether you're from the mountains of Wales or Scotland or Cumbria or the upland areas of Dartmoor or Exmoor, the sort of hardships that come along with upland farming are things that you'd perhaps recognise. So a story much more relevant, not just to our local visitors, but perhaps nationally as well, and the visitors that come and visit us when they're on holiday or whatever, or what have you. So we went out to try and find a farm that would be suitable. Fortunately for us, perhaps unfortunately for the region, there are many upland farms that have over the years fallen into disuse and disrepair. You just have to drive through Teesdale, Weardale, Swaledale, and they're dotted all over the hillsides. So actually finding a farm, if you like, that might be suitable wasn't particularly hard. What we wanted was something fairly typical, and also a lot of these areas are still owned. The fields are still, the buildings are still owned. They're not necessarily abandoned. That they're abandoned in that the families may have moved further down the valley into sort of more efficient farmsteads, if you like, for Weardale. But often these buildings are still owned. Well, I'll get on with it. You'll see what this particular one was being used for as I go through some of the pictures. So we took a trip, to cut a long story short, we took a trip to Weardale, one of the local valleys to us, or fairly local, and we came across, well, we didn't come across this. This was one of the ones we'd seen amongst several, and we liked. This farm built into the hillside, and it's approximately 400 meters above sea level, so it's reasonably high in altitude. To give you an idea, this, I don't know if you can see this here, this is Spain's Field, and that's where it is on a slightly larger map. This is common land here. This is sort of about 1,300 feet above sea level, and the Weardale Valley is down here. And like most of the farms in this area, the story is kind of fairly pastoral. It's sheep. Weardale, still lots of sheep. There's some sort of, as you get further down the valley, there's a little bit of sort of cropping, various things, but predominantly it's the sheep, and it's the raising of sheep and a few cattle. And that's what Spain's Field had done, and the farm that still owns it somewhere is this down here, the Rain family. As I said, the idea, we were locked away for quite a long time, 5 days, and told to, as I mentioned, told to look at the stories we were telling at Beamish. And we really wanted to tell a story that was more about, dare I say, sort of normal farming rather than the high farming that we tell, and we continue to tell as part of our story at the museum. So a slightly different elevation. It's very bleak. Even in summer, it can be pretty bleak in Weardale, and this meant that the recording and dismantling process had quite a short lead time in many respects, or not lead time. We were very, very limited by what the weather would throw at us. There were weeks when we couldn't work on it. You had to really make the best of the weather with the recording and the dismantling. But it's a very typical farm for Weardale, farmstead for Weardale. This I found quite frightening, because when you get involved with a project, you think you've been involved for sort of 2 or 3 years from start to fruition, and it was only when I looked at this recording by Peter Ryder, who did some work in the early stages of the recording of the farm, getting some sort of dates for us, that I realised we've been working on this for a decade. It becomes quite frightening that, and you think you were sort of, 10 years, and it has flown from the day we kind of first went up there to actually getting it open and the public into seeing it. So we can, from this, the farm dates in its present state from about 1700, but the kind of archaeological poking round would suggest that there'd been some form of dwelling there since probably about 1300. The name Spain's Field would, depending on who you talk to, it shouldn't really be taken literally as Spain's field. Field probably fold. Spain probably had nothing to do with Spain, but over the years, the dialect and the change in language, the name has become Spain's Field. But probably we haven't managed to work out where Spain's came from. Not adequately yet, anyway. But a name's a name. It's and from about the 1700s, it was referred to as Spain's Field Farm or Spain's Fold Farm. So this is myself and another colleague of about 12 years ago now, on one of our first trips out there. This was one of the outlying pigsties and what we call a cat house. A cat house is in Weardale. Farming was never massively economically enriching, shall we say, financially enriching for the people undertaking it. Most families had to back up their farming with working elsewhere, and in particular Weardale, it would be the lead mines or the quarries that are, several of which are still functioning. So many of the farmers would work in the lead mines quite often during the week. The family was often the people who were responsible for actually the upkeep of the farm. Cats are a poor quality coal. It's often kind of coal dust mixed with clay, which makes kind of smouldering source of heat for your fireplace. So this was probably the cat house, or for a posh name, a sort of cold store, and the pigsty, which is on the other side. Keeping a pig in Weardale, which you'd sort of slaughter annually, sorry, excuse me, was a big part of the farming story. So most families have a couple of pigs, and the slaughtering of a pig was to provide with your bacon for the coming year was quite a big thing. Slightly different elevation. Again, as you can see, it really is quite remote, and there isn't a road to Spain's Field, which I'll talk about a little bit more. The rear view of it, as you can see, it was really suffering as a building. It's in a beautiful spot, as I said, a very bleak spot, but even in, I think, the first visit and this visit were only a couple of weeks apart, and within that time all this roofing stone had already come down, so the building was in really quite a dire state. It was falling down literally as we were surveying it. As you can see, it's really not in a good state. And of course, you know, a lot of people say, Beamish, we don't like taking buildings if they can be preserved where they are. It's not part of our sort of policy, if you like, to go out and rob communities of their buildings. We only take a building if it is the last resort for it, and with agreement, the sort of the community agreement. And this building was not going to be saved in any way, shape or form had we not sort of, I don't mean stepped in, but had we not approached the existing landowners and got their sort of support and backing. What had it been used for? Well, since 1957, which was when the last sort of occupiers moved out and moved down the valley to the sort of bigger family farm, it has been used as really a sheep shelter. So this here is all the way through the house. The first thing we had to do before we could survey it was remove really sort of several tons of sheep poo, which had built up on the ground floor over the years. And then that allowed us to sort of start to properly record the building, to dig a little deeper, to see what was under the existing floor, to start to piece together its story. We've had a lot of challenges with this building. It was incredibly enjoyable, but it was I think probably one of the hardest buildings we've had to move and relocate here, record, and then put back together. Physically, this probably gives you a better idea of the sort of weather we face in the northeast quite regularly. So the sort of spring and summer prior to this was when we really thought, this is the farm. We were going to start the dismantling, and we got hit by very, very snowy weather. Not unusual for Weardale, but when the snow comes down in Weardale, it can come down for several months and it can keep coming down. You do get thaws, but it can keep coming back. So as I sort of briefly mentioned before, we actually have quite a short working window for this kind of project outside of the weather that Weardale can throw at you. So that was the first challenge, was in a way having a team that could drop everything and when the weather was all right, go up and work on it. And that's quite costly, because you've then sort of got to find work for the team elsewhere in between the dismantling of a building. I think the next picture, yeah, even on quite a bright, what starts off as quite a bright day in Weardale, very quickly the storm clouds can run down the valley and make the process again very difficult, very unpleasant. Nobody likes working in torrential rain on what's essentially the middle of or the top of a mountain. It's not the most pleasant experience. As I mentioned before, oh, sorry, I need to go back. Oh, why is that not working? No, that's right. That's totally the wrong. That's actually a different. Sorry. There we go. As I mentioned before, the building, there was no road to the building. The nearest road is about 300 yards that runs across the top of the hill, across the top of the common. So we had to put a new building in, a new road in to the farm, just to transport the stone away as it was taken down. I think all in all, it required the removal of 1,800 tons of material. And of course, that had to be recorded as it was taken down, so that we could put it all back where it came from. We did realise quite soon into the project that it was pointless trying to record the rubble walls. That's just not realistic. It used a lot of small field stone in its construction. So we opted for obviously recording the roof, the chimneys, all the main parts of the building, so the coins, the lintels, windowsills, etc. And the facing stone. But realised that actually the interior kind of rubble wall filling, it was never going to go back in exactly the same place that we took it down from. So facades, all of that was recorded quite meticulously. Rubble wall and rough coursing, it just really wasn't practical, not in the sort of time frame that we had to do it. So the building was removed, the farm was removed. We wanted to tell the story of the farm as it was perhaps in its final days, or final days of usage. The great thing about that was the families of Weardale have often been there for generations. So there's a great opportunity to get all that sort of first-hand evidence, the stories, the lives they led in Weardale. And there's often an assumption that Weardale, being where it is quite cut off. The first thing you realise, and when we started to talk to people properly in Weardale, is that actually Weardale was incredibly well connected. It was one of the through routes between sort of Durham and Cumbria. So the valley floor saw a lot of movement. There was a train service that ran along the valley, and the communities were very, very good at sort of supporting each other and making sure that they stayed connected. So there was a wonderful wealth of information that we sort of that we managed to get from people, and again, people felt very involved with the project, whereas our existing two farms, as I say, were farms that were already on the museum site. This was really the first time we were able to engage with agricultural communities to get their stories and work with them to establish those stories. So lots and lots of outreach, lots of people coming to the farm, to the museum, and quite a few people obviously involved in the process of then re-erecting it and providing us with information. And those stories are now the stories we can that we tell. The farm belonged to a family called the Rains, so we worked very, very closely with them to see what their life was like. But obviously we don't want to be exclusive. We want to use the farm as a catalyst for telling that wider Weardale story. So we can bring in all the the stories about the lead mining and the quarrying that went on there, that sort of agricultural story that went hand in hand with that sort of industrial story of Weardale, which is again often sort of overlooked. The process was quite challenging rebuilding it, not helped by 2 years of in and out of lockdown. Many of us were furloughed at the museum, as I'm sure that's a familiar story across the board. But as per the sort of government advice, buildings didn't stop. So this presented a challenge for a number of us who were furloughed and actually couldn't work. But the actual building, or the re-erecting of the building, didn't stop. Fortunately, because we'd done a lot of work on it beforehand, and we were very interested in the stories. The building was kind of able to go ahead or to continue with not much input from us for quite a few months, which again, it sort of shows, I suppose, the depth of recording of the building, so that the guys responsible for the project had all that evidence and all that detail to actually work on in our sort of, I suppose, our kind of curatorial absence. And there it is. This was a couple of months before opening, all back to work. We made one change though in between this picture and opening. The building is quite small, which means engaging with our public in it is quite difficult. The flow through the building is very difficult from a public point of view. So I suggested we put a door in here, which was agreed. So we have a way in and a way out. Again, so just one small change really to the fabric of the building, but to enable sort of better access, wheelchairs, prams, that kind of thing, which had been slightly overlooked during the actual reconstruction process when we weren't here. So that's the only real change to the actual fabric of the building. Called a wonky pot cottage, because it was always distinguished in Weardale because of this leaning wonky pot. Well, we called it wonky pot cottage, but everyone else would say it's the farm with the wonky pot. So we wanted to make sure that the wonky pot went back on top of the farm wonkily. I don't know whether that's a word. And a nice little picture there of the interior. We were lucky. I don't know whether the picture of the this was the room that was full of sheep poo originally, and this was that range. So we worked again with even with all that sheep poo, and we managed to install the original range that had been left in the farm since it's older than 1950s, but since the family left it. So a very talented chap managed to get our range stored and working again. And this particular photo here is just done some landscaping, and that was taken, I think, about 24 hours before we opened the building to the public. And as I say, yeah, got to put the obligatory thank you National Lottery for helping us sign up, but it has been, we wouldn't have been able to do it without their support, and their support for the project in general, which is seeing a number of or helping us to put a number of buildings up around the museum at the moment. And I think really that's probably just about it. As I say, I don't want to take up too much of your morning. There's a lot of depth I could go into, but really I just wanted to share with you one of the projects we've been working on over the last 10 years. It doesn't seem like 10 years, scarily. Thank you very much.